Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of Merging Minds. Today I have the honor and privilege to speak with Sibelan Forrester, an academic, expert, linguist, and researcher. Before coming to Swarthmore in 1994, she taught for 5 years at Oberlin College, also Russian language and literature. She began teaching Russian just for fun in her first year of college. She was going to be a French or English major. She knows Croatian and Serbian pretty well, French, excellent for reading, limping for speech, German so-so for reading, plus a couple of silly songs, Spanish ditto, the songs are better, and Czech 1 year in graduate school that was eaten by spending 10 months in Zagreb between 1986 and 87. She's made friends with scholars and translators from all over Eastern Europe thanks to mutual interest in Russian poetry. She writes her own books, essays, and poems, and is having a great time teaching the translation workshop. Sibylan has a PhD and MA in Russian literature from Indiana University, PhD in minors in folklore, South Slavic literature and cultures, and an AB with honors in Russian by Bryn Mawr College. Welcome, Sibylan. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you, Gabriel. That was a wonderful introduction. I sound so important.
Sometimes it's nice to hear our accomplishments read by the voice of someone else other than a screen.
Mhm, mhm.
but but
Yeah, yeah.
it's great to be here with you, Sibylan, and you've done so much over your career, and I'd like to contextualize you a little bit around what's going on in our translation world these days, because you know translation at heart, you know the challenges, the intricacies, the beauty, and in our space has always been challenged by technology. A little bit different from literary translations in the sense that with literary translations, you still have people working with a word processor because that's what works best for translating a book or a novel or a piece of poem. But the bulk of, let's say, the translation world is about business. It's about stuff that isn't really literary in that sense, and business gets chewed up by technology. So I guess more broadly, just to get things warmed up, I wonder if you have any take about this dichotomy between technology and humanity, and whether they're opponents, whether they can play together as friends. How do you see this dichotomy?
It's a really good question. And I have friends or former students who are professional translators who work with legal documents, who work with business negotiations, who work with political interpreting. And those always were more mechanical than a literary translation. If you're translating a legal document or a treaty between powers, you really don't want to be getting creative. You want it to say exactly what the thing should say. There's a famous example, though, of an interpreter, and I forget which British prime minister and which French president, I think, were having a conversation, and the British prime minister said something about cricket, and the translator smoothly said something about the Tour de France. And it made perfect sense to both of them, and everyone was happy. So, even in a political translation, you need to have the ability to be thinking on your feet and doing something adequate. For, I think, your instructions for opening your new microwave that was manufactured in another country, it probably is fine to have it translated by a machine, but checked by a human being so you don't get some horrible error. And it edges into things like literary translation or scholarly translation. I mentioned to you when we were emailing before this conversation that I have friends who are very good translators. I would buy any book they translated, and they've been using computer assisted translation for a long time now. And you can use that two ways. You can ask the computer to suggest what it would do, but also it starts to learn how you do it. And if you're translating a novel that's 1,000 pages long, of course, I'm in Russian, so you get novels that are 1,000 pages long, you really don't want to be changing the word you chose previously, or you want your set of 5 synonyms that you might be using just in case. So, an example of why you might need that is the word beautiful. In English, I think we say beautiful usually if it's a person, it could be a child, it could be a woman. It's a little more unusual to say a beautiful man. It's a little more unusual to say a handsome woman. And yet in Russian, there's one word that you would use for both of those cases, and in some other Slavic languages too. So being aware that maybe this isn't the one you're going to use, having the computer know your choices can save a lot of time. Um, my
I
basic
agree.
sorry.
I do have a question though. Do you think somehow that either places a damper on human creativity and this concept of noise in writing? Because let's say the computer is a lot more, even if it's just making a suggestion, right? It's reminding you of certain things that maybe the human mind may forget. And maybe part of being human is that forgetfulness and using a different adjective for a different kind of context or scenario. Do you think it's possible for a human translator or writer, in your experience, and even in the literary context, to be able to leverage, let's say, this benefit of productivity and predictability that's output from a machine and still retain the same level of humanity? Or do you think that somehow that humanity gets compromised by these engines?
No, it's a very good question. I am not as worried about that. If I think about the predictive use artificial intelligence that shows up on your cell phone when you're texting a message and it wants to give you the next word, sometimes very funny choice. Also, if you're sending email now, our institution uses Google Mail, sort of customized, and it also opens up and makes suggestions. And sometimes they're very funny, but we do that too. We do that. The scholar and theoretician Mikhail Bakhtin, who's been used by all kinds of different disciplines by now, talks about the way we pick up the habits of language from other people we've spoken to. And when we speak, our discourse is full of things our great uncle used to say that we thought were clever, and no one else knows, or maybe things that Stalin used to say that you had to say in order not to get yourself arrested and sent off somewhere bad. So I'm not sure there's a hard dividing line between the discourse that a person creates and the stuff that's churned out by the machine. What worries me is the idea that people aren't going to get paid for doing the work. That the machine will be right. Whoever owns the machine is going to make the money, and some poor person is going to be sitting with a red pencil, figuratively fixing the mistakes, but not getting the credit.
Again, I agree. I want to get to the whole economic issue around this because I think it's super on point. But I want to stress a little bit more this permeability of discourse that you're describing, in the sense that there's, and I want to, like, and by the way, I see it as you described it. I do, but there's a big camp of people that really believe in the individual mind. And when you look at copyright law, for instance, it's all based on this idea of the individual, assuming almost that discourse is non-permeable, right? But we're working within this idea of like permeability. But when we are so, and you're describing this example of like an autocomplete, maybe on your phone or your email, and for you, it's not at least as you're describing it, it's the synthetic discourse isn't getting in the way of the natural discourse. I would say for me sometimes that's the case. Sometimes I feel that the synthetic discourse is just the fact that there's a suggestion there may change my thought pattern or where I was going with something. Because yeah, sometimes it's just a funny suggestion and I'll ignore it, but sometimes it's a suggestion that will make me rethink. I see this all the time, even with things like Grammarly or just devices that
Mhm.
will help me write better. If I take it too far, I notice that I'll look at the text. I won't get any warnings anymore for any kinds of grammar errors, but I'll look at the email and I'm not even sure I wrote it in the first place. So, how do you feel about that? Like, is there, like, when you talk about this discourse permeability, let's say between our conversation, and if we add like a third agent, a synthetic agent, is it still the same, or is there a qualitative difference when you add a synthetic agent in the mix?
Oh, of course, there's a difference. Yeah, for sure. And if we even had like a running caption at the bottom of the screen as we were speaking, it would probably, as the word moves to the left, it would catch my attention. And I would think, oh, wait, I do want to say something about that. I imagine now, I've never worn an earpiece while I was talking to somebody, but I've seen people do that. And I imagine you have somebody saying something in your ear, it's a similar intrusion, and you can ignore it, you can turn the volume down, you can just pull it out and say, "I quit," right? But, I don't know. I think maybe because I wrote for such a long time before they were making suggestions, there are times when I really find I'm sending a polite email to someone saying, "Yes, I'm going to read this. I'll get back to you." It takes a lot less time when I can just hit yes, 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 yes on the suggestions. But I think that the distinction here is between the original author and the translator. So the original author, want to be saying what it is that you want to be saying, and maybe you should be sitting with a notebook and a nice fountain pen in a cafe with a steaming cup of coffee, working on what it is you think, as opposed to as opposed to me, I, the translator, get your text, and then I am going to be investigating what it is you meant to say in all kinds of different ways. I'll be checking dictionaries. I'll be investigating with native speakers. I'll be getting back to you since you're a living author. Hooray! Working with a living author is a wonderful thing, and saying, "Did you mean exactly this?" And occasionally it's happened to me when I asked an author, "Did you mean this?" They said, "Oh, you're right, it's not clear." And they changed it in the original. But that was working with a living author, and that particular author, I think, wasn't too full of herself.
That's super interesting because I think like the whole idea of authorship and translation and interpretation of text, they're all very tied together, right? And I at least from my experience, I think I agree with you that there are certain contexts where having that efficiency is a huge
Mhm,
driver. Again,
mhm,
like a simple email, I just want to confirm, yes, I'll be there and blah blah blah. That's great, right? But then there are, for me, writing, and we'll get to translation, but just simple writing, and I would say even prosaic, simple writing is in itself a creative process, and more than creative, a learning process for me. Like you
mhm,
mentioned, like,
mhm.
if you're just reading your own subtitles, your own captions, you'd be like, maybe I want to talk more about that. And as we speak, as we interact, we're learning. And I wonder what happens in a world where more of this process takes place synthetically in these more learning kinds of contexts. Like, for instance, let's say I'm writing a paper for your class. Instead of really thinking about each of these sentences and how I'm going to put things together and what structure I'm going to use and how I'm going to argument for my points or my thesis, if I'm being, let's say, aided by an external synthetic agent, how much of the learning do you think is still mine?
That's a very good question, and I've been reading comments on Facebook from colleagues who are professors at other institutions, and it's concerning if somebody decides I'm taking this course because I have to, it's required. I'm not that interested in the actual topic. I just want to pass it, and has Chat GPT write an essay for them. I would say the only bit of learning that's taking place is learning how to cheat yourself out of a learning experience in the class. In the summer, I taught a course on writing to a small group of students. And my colleague and I, who were doing this, decided to have them do an assignment where they were supposed to ask ChatGPT to write an essay about a topic they thought was interesting, and then critique it and improve it, and point out where it wasn't representing their ideas or wasn't representing their voices. And I hope that inoculated them against the idea. Because the problem with these ChatGPT essays, first of all, if you give it a humanities topic, quote unquote, it gives you a 5-paragraph essay. It must have been trained on college application essays or something, and that all the final paragraph always ends in conclusion, that or begins in conclusion. But the if you ask it a scientific topic or a kind of more social science topic, it gives you something with paragraphs that are numbered and organized in a different way. So it doesn't even know, or I guess it does know. The problem is it does know. It's absorbed the format. So yeah, you can totally waste your time doing something like that. I don't see a problem with asking ChatGPT to write up ideas, and then maybe say in your first footnote, I used ChatGPT to give me some ideas. Then I went and made sure that the things it said it was quoting from actually existed. Again, we're hearing about lawyers who trusted ChatGPT to write up some case studies, and I guess it was Cohen, that lawyer who had been working for Donald Trump, was forgiven by the judge for having done this. The man's a lawyer. This is something you may have tried. I tried before having the class do this assignment. I asked ChatGPT to write an essay about me, and I'm not that well known, but on the other hand, I have a name that nobody else has. And it said that I had gone to Russia when I was still in high school. It said I had won a Guggenheim Fellowship, which wouldn't that have been nice? So I think somewhere on some web page, my name occurs along with information about somebody else who won a Guggenheim Fellowship. So it was just, as they say, hallucinating crazily. So, on the other hand, the assignment was not to write a work of fiction, and I would be horrified, I think, to see at this point, at least, what artificial intelligence was creating may be appropriate for a genre that has a lot of repetition. Maybe it could generate a romance novel. There have been reports too about science fiction publishers in particular getting bombed with awful works that were clearly created by ChatGPT and some AI. Somebody was out there charging poor souls who had writing ambitions $20 a pop to get the advice to do this and then submit it to the publisher, who said, "We're now shutting down our submissions process. We're gonna have to figure out a way not to be getting this crap."
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by this whole like permeability of discourse thing, just because it's so like you mentioned the learning example, right? And for me, I agree again 100%. If you're in college and your goal is to learn, and you're using GPT to write your papers for you, you're not learning, right? To me, that's a very clear cut thing, and you're basically like quoting you, you're wasting your time. But then you start getting into the gray areas where I didn't ask GPT to write the paper for me. I just asked it for an idea, or I asked it to fix my grammar or fix my writing or make it more clear. And with the feeling I get is that with each of these requests, like fix my grammar or do this, yeah, you're becoming a little bit more distant from that learning process, right? If I have to, even just checking my grammar, in my opinion, I'm learning something from that beyond grammar. I'm rereading my words. I'm really sitting with that. And there's also, I think, a profound sense of loneliness when you're writing. It's you and the paper. And in my opinion, part of the experience is about that. And it's the same thing. I mean, if we decided to co-author something, that would be different. But if we're writing alone, which I think most college papers are individual endeavors, all of a sudden you lose that. And you're no longer like rereading your paper for grammar. Now you don't have to think that much about when you have a block on a given paragraph. And sure, the doors that are open are really cool, but you're no longer the one doing the effort to open those doors. I just wonder like what gets lost, because in college, like I said, I think it's more clear cut, but when you get out into, let's say, the typical business world, not doing the work is considered a win, right? It's an efficiency, but there's
No,
something being lost in the process.
no, absolutely. And I mean, I think you could say, okay, this person who's using ChatGPT for a business purpose is saving time, right? That's a clear win. They're getting more work done because they're saving time. Let's hope that's win number two. But then the third thing would be they, in the end, have the knowledge and the style to add a few personal touches to this business letter that ChatGPT has crafted for them. But for God's sake, to look through the letter and make sure it's not lying or hallucinating. And in a way, that would be just like having a good secretary who could write the letter for you. I know some people who, once it became possible to dictate to text, found that incredibly useful. And they would dictate to text and then they would go in and fix the document and be very, very happy about the results. And it made me think of Fyodor Dostoevsky, right, one of the most famous writers in the world, who in fact would compose his works largely orally, and at one point was going to lose copyright to his work if he didn't finish a novel within a month or something, hired a stenographer, and she wrote down what he was sort of yelling as he walked back and forth in this very theatrical way, and he got his copyright preserved, and then he married her.
Wow.
So that was like 18, I don't know, 1860 something, or maybe the early 1870s, but no, I think it was the 1860s. I got to be correct here as a professor, but in fact, there's been this mingling of discourse that you talk about through literature a lot more than we think. Tolstoy's wife, to bring up the other big guy of the Tolstoyevsky duo, Tolstoy's wife um, copied over his corrected drafts. And there was a time when she finished copying over one of his famous novels and then went into labor and had their baby in the morning. And then he would scratch it up with his corrections again. And who knows how much she was correcting his grammar. We can't really say unless the drafts are in the archive somewhere. So it's true, yes, that you get the individual writing and that romantic ideal or the poetic ideal of somebody who's just expressing their own soul, and yet they're using that language from their great uncle, or they're writing addressing the person they're in love with, or addressing the person they're pissed off by, or the mysterious stranger sitting across the bar. That I think that the problem is the laziness more than the interference of a mechanical voice. Because again, the mechanical voice was trained on human discourse of a higher or lower quality.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but when I deconstruct what you're saying, I understand. Well, if there's no original to begin with, then there's no copy, right? And it's kind of like that. And there's no point of origin in discourse. It's this flowy thing, and I agree that the challenge is in the laziness and or the fact that in the example that you mentioned, like if you have someone who's doing part of the work for you, you must have put in the work that predates that allows you to look at that interaction and know exactly what needs to be changed. And like maybe it's like in my opinion, just like cooking, in the sense that if you really know what you're doing, maybe you're going to taste it and you're going to say it just needs this much salt. And if you don't know that much what you're doing, maybe you're going to add some salt and paprika and all this stuff, and it's still not going to taste great. But it's like the number of interventions in writing doesn't equate quality, right? It's about knowing how and where to change. But you mentioned something that I never knew about Dostoevsky. I had no idea that he dictated orally most of his works. That's
I'm not sure
fascinating.
it was most of it, but that work for sure, the novel called The Gambler, he
Wow.
dictated and then married his stenographer who was very good for him. She took good
Wow.
care of him. She kept him from drinking too much and from gambling.
Wow.
And the reason why he had almost lost the copyright was because he had gambled. So
Wow.
there's another story that has nothing to do with ChatGPT, but maybe yes, right? Tell ChatGPT what should I bet on this roulette table. Ugh.
But it does connect in a way, and I'm curious. Just this is just something for me personally, but I remember when I was reading the brothers Karamazov, I was fascinated by the writing and the style. The book like completely captured me in a way that like I just couldn't stop reading, and I was also all the time so curious about what it must be like to read that same book in Russian. And I'm wondering, have you read it both the translated and the original? Or there are many different translations too, right? Of
Yes,
the
there are
Brothers
many different
Karamazov.
translations. I read the translation first because I wasn't up to the original, and then I read the original later on, and it's really gripping. Absolutely, one thing that a lot of the translations of Dostoevsky doesn't convey is that there's a lot of kind of earthy language, and it's not so much that they're swearing and using obscenity because they wouldn't have done that. It wouldn't have made it past the censor. But sort of folk language, colloquial expressions. In one point in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, the axe murderer, is in a tavern and starts chatting with this other young man and using sort of thieves' jargon. He's using this very um, colloquial, sort of lower class winking speech to the other guy and then leaves him all confused. And in some of the translations, you don't get that, and it doesn't make sense why the guy he's talking to is so confused. So, so it's hard. It's hard to edge into translation just a little bit. And I think the reason why is that the novel was really long. The people translating early on maybe didn't know the words so well and kind of smoothed it out for the Anglo reader.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that because I don't know that many languages, but the ones I do, I have such a hard time reading translated books. As much as I appreciate translation, I mean, it's my profession. But when I can get access to the original, I would always rather read the original. And I don't know if that's the case with Russian, but I definitely notice that when I'm reading texts that were authored in Portuguese or Spanish, for instance, like when you get like a Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, something like that, it has a certain flow in Spanish, a certain literary poetry that's I don't think it's a matter of not being translated well enough. I don't even know if it can be translated. Like it's like rewriting. It would require rewriting a different work, and as good as it would be different from that original piece.
No, the translators from Spanish and Portuguese are really excellent. Because when I stop and think, because I go to the translation conference, I met Gregory Rabassa in an elevator, who translated a whole bunch of the Boom authors, and was a very gracious man, I have to say. He was nice in the elevator. He didn't, like, look at my name tag and then humph and turn away. So there, hooray for translators. And, for, in terms of translation, I think, why not ask ChatGPT to do it and then see what happens? I was at a poetry reading, virtual poetry reading at noon today, and there was a translator who was born in Ukraine, moved to Israel, then moved back to Moscow maybe 18 years ago. And in order to recover Russian, which had been her language of childhood, although she said she spoke it in a very Ukrainian particular way, and then left right after they invaded in February of 2022. And she said none of these languages are really her native language. Her Hebrew from living in Israel had kind of fallen behind because she moved to Moscow. Her English was always a learned language. She hadn't ever lived in an Anglophone place. And so she said, Google is always my co author. And I wrote that down to tell you in this podcast because I thought, yes, absolutely. Google Translate can give you some good suggestions. And it's like a correction on a student translation. I always tell my students, if I make a suggestion, you might say, great, this is better, and accept it. You might say, nope, I'm confident in my first version. Or you might say, that makes me think of this third thing that I like better. And so the mechanical version can be like your professor's correction in giving you the option or not. So I've taken up the habit of copying the translated version from Facebook. The Facebook translations of poetry can be very bad, and they're not so bad from Russian. You know, there are mistakes because it's poetry, but Facebook and the web in general has a whole lot of Russian on it. I think that the Russian internet is the second biggest internet after English. I think that's still true, and if you want to read any Russian classic, Gabriel, if you start learning Russian and want to go do Brothers Karamazov, which is what, 1,400 pages in Russian, it's right there on the web. And all of the classic works are right there on the web. And all of Russian science fiction is there on the web. And all of the Russian translations of Karel Čapek's science fiction and Stanislav Lem's science fiction, because they didn't care about copyright in the 1990s, who knew how to make a web page? It was all these guys who loved science fiction. But so anyway, the Facebook translations from Russian aren't abysmal usually. The ones from Ukrainian get kind of iffy. And then from a language like Serbian that just doesn't have as many speakers, doesn't have an internet of that magnitude, it can be horrible. It can be really embarrassing. And yet, you make the copy, you paste it in, maybe it makes you laugh, maybe you have a whole line where you say, "Ah, that'll do for now, and then I'll see how it all fits together. I'll get back to the author and see what she thinks."
Yeah, I agree. I think one thing that fascinates me about what you were saying, the sense of even if there is a dialogical process with Google Translate or something suggesting, or your professor, anything suggesting something different, you're still firmly believing in the idea of agency and you being able to see, yeah, yeah, that what Sibyl saying makes sense. I'm going to go with that, or no, I understand where she's coming from, but I'm going to go with this. But what I wonder is how much agency is a function of education and values and upbringing, and how can you make sure that it's still there? Because like I said, both of us can write a paper with GPT, and you can write with full agency and I can write with zero agency. How, I mean, it's not about how can we tell. I'm more concerned about the underpinnings of that, is like, how do we even begin to teach people about the value of agency? And then getting into your previous question from the beginning, how do we reward people for that? How do we compensate people for that?
Mhm, mhm. Now
Because in my opinion,
you're
go
getting
ahead.
into some real financial and political questions there, and also who has access to acceptable English, right? Who says that something is acceptable? What about the student in my class who grew up in China and their English is pretty good, but it's not native? What about there was this wonderful kid in my class, I shouldn't say kid, but he's He's younger than my kids are. A wonderful young man who was born in Colombia, had native Spanish thanks to his family, although he'd grown up in the US. And he had a wonderful song, and he wanted to have the title be "Oh, What a Night." And I said, "There, that would make any reader think of the Frankie Valli and whatever it is, right? Oh, what a night, late December, back in '63." And the students looked at me blankly, and then one of them, ones in the group working with him, said, "Oh, I heard that once at a gas station." And I thought, okay, you know what? They're right. A person of a certain age is going to think Frankie Valli, but somebody in their 20s is not going to think that. He can go right ahead and say, "Oh, what a night," for his title. So there's that as well, right? Which audience are you aiming for? Which readers are going to be the ones? I think that a bad editor, an editor who takes out anything bad you say about Putin, right, in your piece, might be much worse than a ChatGPT. And the worst of all would be a mechanized editor who takes out anything bad you say about Stalin, right? And flags that and says, no, you have to, change it to this, change it to this. But that could be a human being just as well.
I agree. But in going back to, like, let's say the actual translation and economic scenario. So if I'm working with GPT, right? In academics, let's say in my opinion, the key thing is the key issue, and based on what you're describing to me, is around learning, right? Is learning taking place or not? And if learning is not taking place, then there's no point in using GPT. But as long as it is, then it's good. At least that's what I'm understanding. But when it comes to translation, the translation buyers don't care about whether a translator is learning or not. They care about how much they're going to be charged for that translation. And again, I think then the question is, well, how do you measure? So translations have been, for a very long time, been measured in volume of words or pages, but in volume of text, basically. And now we're moving into a place where volume of text may not mean effort anymore. Actually, typically does not mean effort, because, as you described, for instance, maybe you could write a 10-page paper that I'm re-editing, and maybe I'm going to sit on that for a week, and I'm going to read that 100 times, and I'm going to make my best tweaks here and there, and maybe it's going to turn out unbelievable, and we're going to be awarded some kind of medal, and maybe it's going to be even worse than the first draft that you submitted to me, or vice versa. And so you start to get into writing quality as the main driver and effort, but a combination. Do you have any idea of how that could be measured, if there is a way, like, to objectively define that?
It's such a good question, and I think that there's a history of translators trying to establish a base rate and then being accused of a monopoly, trying to create a monopoly. So there was a case where translators were sued for discussing what their rates were on their email list. I was not as involved in translation at that moment, but I've heard echoes of that having happened. And again, the difference, I think, is between the perceived value of the original. So if you go to somebody to translate your diploma from Sao Paulo, say that you did a special MFA there that shows not just that you're a good writer, but that your Portuguese is awesome, you would have to go to somebody who was certified by the ATA and get the stamp. And you're going to pay for that. You're going to pay for that, even if it took them 2 minutes to do the translation, because their Brazilian is so good. They could just quickly pipe it through. I've read translations of, I want to say, quick and dirty Russian fiction. There was a novel based on a video game that I saw riddled with errors, and it wasn't because it was ChatGPT, because it was before that, but because the translator, who isn't bad, was in a great rush and wasn't getting paid enough. So, right again, there's a moment where you say, this is actually real literature. We want to have this translated in a way that really is eligible for the Nobel Prize, say. Right, that's going to impress readers, that's going to make them think, this is really good stuff. I see why they say this Polish writer is worthy. And what I mostly translate is poetry, and that never pays. That never pays. And I suppose you could have ChatGPT translate a poem, or keep the one in Facebook as a kind of exercise in absurdity, because if depending on the poem, of course, some poems are fairly staid in what they're saying, and yet have gorgeous stylistic things going on with phonetics that As far as I know, ChatGPT has not been trained on phonetics and cannot do that yet, although that might happen too. So I
Yeah,
figure if I'm doing translations of poetry, I'm not taking work away from somebody who's making a living by doing translation, because you can't make a living translating poetry.
for sure. As beautiful as it is, and I think that's, but that I think points exactly on what the kind of problem is. I think part of the reason, sure, that you can't make a living translating poetry is that there's very little market for poems these days. So it doesn't, it doesn't generate enough volume, economic volume, to pay people enough to do that. Another part of the reason is that it takes a disproportional amount of time to translate every single line, right? You're going to spend maybe a week maybe to translate a few lines. And I understand that that's an edge case, that's an extreme, but even when you're looking at text, for instance, paying people as data validators in the scenario that you described, for instance, where they're just looking for, something that's a blatant error and removing that or fixing that, or something that's entirely inaccurate, that's one scenario. But paying people because they have editorial capabilities, and maybe it's just a business presentation, but a few words can make the difference between a deal closing and not closing. And the tone, the style, there's so much that's communicated, at least in my opinion, even in like what seems to be like flat business discourse. There's a big cultural literary load behind it. It doesn't, it's not as interesting as anything literary, but there is a lot of hidden context and all of that, and it can get easily lost in a bad translation. But I think the challenge is, this industry has been so mechanical for such a long time. Like, you have like poetry, okay, that's one thing, and it's an outlier. But for the most part, it's like volume of words, error rates, things that can be quantified, are the things that are typically looked after. But now it just seems to me that it's hard to quantify, because you and I can both go over, let's say, 10 pages of translation output, and maybe I'll make 50 changes, you'll make 500 changes, but maybe my 50 changes are going to produce better work than your
Mhm.
500
Yeah,
changes, or vice
entirely
versa.
possible. Mhm.
And so even like the number of changes isn't representative of the work that's put in. Maybe you studied all your life to know exactly what 50 changes you need to make. Maybe I'm just fresh out of college and I'm making 500 changes because I don't know what I'm doing. So then you get into the issue. Okay, how do you would have to have a very, very good assessment of the value that each of these changes is bringing, which is super hard, because then that would get into literary analysis, and even you and I may disagree over whether the change is good or bad and how much it helps. So it's, in my opinion, like, there, like, if you begin to dissect this question of like, how do you still pay people in this paradigm where they're heavily aided by machine engines, it gets super complicated super quickly, because it's not just anymore a matter of paying per hour or paying per, it's very difficult to arrive at a unit that's both measurable and representative of the work that's being produced.
Yep, that's true, and I think that for the top level translators, the people who already have a reputation, being able to use, digital assistants, and so I think computer assisted translation, you can choose how much you want the computer to intervene, and it can just be keeping track of your own vocabulary choices, or it can be suggesting, it can be throwing up the 5 synonyms out of its dictionary, right? Those people can use that, and it can speed them way up, and they can still get the rewards. They'll be invited to do interesting translations. I mentioned Tolstoy and Dostoevsky previously, and there are still new translations of them coming out because the publishers know that they're used in teaching and that they'll sell a bunch of copies. Whereas, your latest Brazilian poet, maybe a small book will come out from a small press, and as you say, it doesn't pay. There are definitely people who are making a living as poets, but they're mostly doing it as teachers of creative writing. And the people who are making a living as translators of poets are probably doing it because they're teachers of translation in a creative writing program. There aren't as many of those, but there are more than there used to be. Actually, people are recognizing the value of a creative education for translators. But you're talking, I think, more about the pay per word ATA. I'm hiring someone to translate my article into French because I was invited to submit it to this French collection, but I don't have good enough French. And figuring out what I'm going to pay them. Are they going to use ChatGPT to grind it through, or are they going to? I'm not sure ChatGPT will even do that. If you, I haven't even done anything besides see that I got a Guggenheim Fellowship. ChatGPT. So it's a good question. How do you evaluate? I mean, the whole idea of paying by the page or paying by the word is already a fraught idea
Yeah.
because in English, for example, compared to Russian, there are more words in English. There are just words like the that Russian doesn't have that are all over the place on the page. And so, and yet the typical word is shorter. And so you're going to have more words. It's just going to bulk out that way. And how do you figure out the cost per word? See, you can tell I'm not a professional translator, or I would know these things.
No, but it's more the concept, and I think you hit the nail on the head. It's the per word or per volume is already a fraud idea to begin with, and now this new paradigm just really stretches on that. But I'm super thankful for our conversation, Sibyl. It's been an honor, privilege. I've been learning so much. I'm going to research more on Dostoevsky because I thought I knew a little bit about his life. Apparently, I know nothing.
Not the
As
not the wife bit, not the stenographer become wife. It was his
Yeah,
second wife.
I had no idea about that, and I just find it always fascinating whenever I'm learning. And I loved all of your thoughts and opinions on the permeability of discourse. This was really wonderful. And before we wrap up, is there any place that people who are interested in learning more about you and your work can find more about you? Is there anything that you would like to point people to?
I am easy to Google because there isn't another Sibelan Forrester, but I have a translation of a Ukrainian novel that came out from the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. That was my most recent book publication. And I hope that people are reading translations of poetry. And if they don't find mine, they'll find some good ones.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. It was an honor, a privilege, Sibylan, and I look forward to catching up on more of your work and your research, and really appreciate the time and all of the learning that I was able to do. Thank you. And thank you everybody for watching another episode of Merging Minds. Till next time.